This is A Course in Miracles, Manual for Teachers, Part 19. What is justice? Justice is the divine correction for injustice. Injustice is the basis for all the judgments of the world. Justice corrects the interpretations to which injustice gives rise and cancels them out. Neither justice nor injustice exists in heaven, for error is impossible and correction meaningless. In this world, however, forgiveness depends on justice, since all attack can only be unjust. Justice is the Holy Spirit's verdict upon the world. Except in his judgment, justice is impossible, for no one in the world is capable of making only just interpretations and laying all injustices aside. If God's Son were fairly judged, there would be no need for salvation. The thought of separation would have been forever inconceivable. Justice, like its opposite, is an interpretation. It is, however, the one interpretation that leads to truth. This becomes possible because, while it is not true in itself, justice includes nothing that opposes truth. There is no inherent conflict between justice and truth. One is but the first small step in the direction of the other. The path becomes quite different as one goes along. Nor could all the magnificence, the grandeur of the scene, and the enormous opening vistas that rise to meet one as the journey continues be foretold from the outset. Yet even these, whose splendor reaches indescribable heights as one proceeds, falls short indeed of that weight when the pathway ceases and time ends with it. But somewhere one must start. Justice is the beginning. All concepts of your brothers and yourself, all fears of future states, and all concerns about the past stem from injustice. Here is the lens which, held before the body's eyes, distorts perception and brings witness of the distorted world back to the mind that made the lens and holds it very dear. Selectively and arbitrarily is every concept of the world built up in just this way. Sins are perceived and justified by careful selectivity, in which all thought of wholeness must be lost. Forgiveness has no place in such a scheme, for not one sin but seems forever true. Salvation is God's justice. It restores to your awareness the wholeness of the fragments you perceive as broken off and separate, and it is this that overcomes the fear of death. For separate fragments must decay and die, but wholeness is immortal. It remains forever and forever like its creator, being one with him. God's judgment is his justice. Unto this, a judgment wholly lacking in condemnation, an evaluation based entirely on love, you have projected your injustice, giving God the lens of warped perception through which you look. Now it belongs to him and not to you. You are afraid of him and do not see you hate and fear yourself as enemy. Pray for God's justice and do not confuse his mercy with your own insanity. Perception can make whatever picture the mind desires to see. Remember this. In this lies either heaven or hell, as you elect. God's justice points to heaven just because it is entirely impartial. It accepts all evidence that is brought before it, omitting nothing, and assessing nothing as separate and apart from all the rest. From this one standpoint does it judge, and this alone. Here all attack and condemnation becomes meaningless and indefensible. Perception rests, the mind is still, and light returns again. Vision is now restored. What had been lost has now been found. The peace of God descends on all the world, and we can see. And we can see. This section's interesting. Because to me, justice, I interpreted as, before the word justice, I interpreted as very relevant to the world, as in what the world or what society collectively has deemed as being just or right or wrong. And this brings it back to what justice really is about. So, neither justice nor injustice exists in heaven, for error is impossible and correction meaningless. In this world, however, forgiveness depends on justice, since all attack can only be unjust. And basically in heaven or being one with God, there's no such thing as justice. There's no need for justice because there's no such thing as unjust. There's no duality. There's no opposite. It's just beingness. So justice is something of the world. However, it basically implies that we need justice as a step to get to heaven, in a sense. And it says, if God's Son were fairly judged, there would be no need for salvation. And when I read that, I thought about all the times that in the last several days I've been judging other people, judging God's Son. And it brought me a lot of pain and conflict internally because I was holding on to judgment, and I know that that isn't true. And so I had to make a shift in my mind to perceive correctly, meaning not to judge. And, whatever I was witnessing in other people, that's really myself. And I had to just take responsibility and realize that I had been judging myself so harshly. And so this is such a great reminder that if God's Son were fairly judged, there would be no need for salvation. If you were judged fairly, as in if you saw without judgment yourself and others, then you're already at peace. There's no need for salvation. And it says that I love this I love this line here of, nor could all the magnificence, the grandeur of the scene, and the enormous opening vistas. I don't remember how to say it now in English, that rise to meet one as the journey continues, be foretold from the outset. Yet even these, whose splendor reaches indescribable heights as one proceeds, fall short indeed of all that weight when the pathway ceases and time ends with it. But somewhere one must start. Justice is the beginning. Salvation is God's justice. It restores to your awareness the wholeness of the fragments you perceive as broken off and separate. And it is this that overcomes the fear of death. For separate fragments must decay and die, but wholeness is immortal. And yes, it overcomes the fear of death. And death is something I've been contemplating about recently after a conversation with a Buddhist teacher. And he was saying that he tends to focus on certain kinds of meditations, mostly that are like loving kindness and compassion focused meditations, and that he's sort of less attracted to the ones where you contemplate about death. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm interested in. And for me, it reminds me of, say, ayahuasca, which translated is vine of death. And so many times in different ceremonies, ayahuasca has confronted me with death and shown me my fear of death and how much I cling so much to this, like, no, I don't want to die. I'm afraid of dying. I don't want to let go of this. But how many times over and over again do I have to allow myself to die in the ceremony in my mind and let go of that? Because it's not real death. It's just ego death, in a sense, like holding on to what I believe to be who I am. And the dying that happens is just the letting go of clinging onto these fragments. And every time that I encounter this, facing this fear of letting go of this fragmented self-identity, it opens me up to the possibility of knowing who I really am and actually overcoming that fear of death. Because wholeness is immortal. And if we really know that, if we really know it, embody it, not just as a thought and as a concept, but if we experience it, then there's nothing to fear at all. And I also was drawn to this line of, perception can make whatever picture the mind desires to see. And personally, I spent many years pursuing photography, or really loving photography because of what the potential it had to do in terms of sharing a message. And for me, it was always about having a unique perspective or going outside of the box and trying to share a perspective that someone may not have seen before. And it was more about the mind, about perception of mind and expanding that rather than trying to capture a fixed image. And it makes sense why I was so drawn to photography. And now I'm not so drawn to photography. I still enjoy it. I mean, it's become just an ubiquitous part of everyday life for everybody. But what I'm more interested in now is about realizing that perception is not even about the external experience so much as the internal experience in our minds. And yeah, it says, remember this, in this lies either heaven or hell as you elect. And again, going back to photography, there was a point where I was really thinking of just delving into photojournalism. And I went to one of these festivals, the biggest one, the biggest photojournalism festival in the world in France. And I just saw that what the field was and what it was really promoting in a way was sort of chasing drama, chasing war, chasing negativity, death, and destruction. And those were the things that sold. That's where a lot of industry work was. And I realized that that wasn't for me because it was in a way like chasing hell. If I envisioned a potential path that I could have gone from there, it would have been chasing conflict and war and difficult scenarios, places in the world where humans are suffering, basically. And I had to reflect and realize that I didn't want to spend my life focusing on that. I wanted to focus more on what would take me more to heaven, and not necessarily through photography, but realizing that we have so much potential in our minds and in ourselves as beings, in what we want to choose in terms of how we want to live our lives, but also how we want to perceive the world. And, you know, what images, what concepts do we want to share? And to me now, it's much more clear that I want to share a message where we realize that we have the option, where we have the ability to create a different reality from the one that we thought that we were given, and that peace is possible. So that's all I want to share with that. And yes, this line related to vision and perception and photography for me. Perception rests, the mind is still, and light returns again. Vision is now restored. And yeah, for me, I think my pursuit of photography and what I really was looking for or seeking is vision, is true vision, not just honing the technical vision of using a camera, but have it what it really means to have true vision. And I feel that I'm finally on this path, on this course in miracles. So that's it for now.